The crystalline chambers of Ethermore glowed with 1,000 colors as the Galactic Council gathered for what they believed would be a routine meeting. The elder races had ruled the galaxy for 10,000 years, and they felt safe in their power. The elves sat in their silver chairs with robes that shimmered like moonlight, and the insectoid Krathar clicked their mandibles in what passed for laughter among their kind. The massive stone beings called the Dolmar stood silent as mountains, and the energy creatures known as the Lumini flickered with what might have been amusement. Commander Amy Harrison stood before them all with her simple blue uniform looking plain. Next to all the ancient glory that surrounded her, she held a data tablet in her hands, and her jaw was set with determination, even though she knew what was coming. Amy had been a soldier for 20 years, and she had seen things that would make most people lose sleep. But today, she felt something she rarely experienced. She felt afraid, not of battle, but of being ignored. The human delegation had come to warn the council about something terrible, and Amy knew in her bones that no one would listen. Behind Amy stood Kate Mitchell with her intelligence officer uniform and a face that showed no emotion, even though inside she was screaming at the unfairness of it all. Kate had spent months gathering the evidence, and every piece of data pointed to the same terrible conclusion. Something was waking up in the dark nebula, and it was coming for them all. The High Chancellor of the Silverian Empire rose from his throne, and his ancient face showed nothing but contempt. He was over 2,000 years old, and he had seen hundreds of younger races come before the council with their fears and warnings. None had ever been right. The Chancellor spoke with a voice like wind through crystal caves, and he said that humanity was young and foolish, and that they saw threats where none existed. The other council members made sounds of agreement, and the Krathar clicked their mandibles again in that laughing way. Amy felt her hands grip the tablet tighter, but she kept her voice steady. She activated the holographic display, and images filled the air above the council chamber, dark ships emerging from dead space and whole colonies going silent without sending distress signals and sensor readings that made no sense, according to any known physics. The luminae flickered brighter, and one of them said in a voice like singing crystal that the readings were clearly equipment malfunction. The Dolmar remained silent as they always did, but their stillness felt dismissive. Kate stepped forward then, and she spoke for the first time. She told them about the pattern and how the disappearances matched an ancient cycle, and how every 10,000 years something came from the dark places between stars. The Krathar stopped their clicking, and for a moment there was silence. Then the Chancellor laughed, and it was not a kind sound. He told Kate that she was speaking of fairy tales and old myths that elder races told their children to scare them into behaving. He said that humanity had only been in space for a few centuries and that they could not possibly understand the true history of the galaxy. Amy felt something break inside her then, and she wanted to shout at them all and tell them they were fools, but she held her tongue. She had been a soldier too long to let anger make her decisions. Instead, she bowed her head in the way the council demanded, and she gathered her data and prepared to leave. The council dismissed them with waves of hands and appendages and energy flickers, and Amy and Kate walked toward the great doors of the chamber. The meeting was over, and humanity had failed to convince anyone. Outside in the night gardens of Ethermore, the air smelled of flowers that had no name in human languages, and twin moons cast silver light across ancient stones. Amy stood by a fountain, and she looked up at the stars and wondered how many people would die. Because of this day, Kate stood beside her, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to say. They had tried, and they had failed, and now they could only return to Earth and prepare for what was coming. Then Amy heard footsteps behind her, and she turned to see something that made her breath catch. An elf woman walked toward them through the gardens, and she moved like water flowing over stones. Her hair was silver and fell past her waist, and her eyes were the color of distant nebulas. She wore armor that seemed to be made of starlight itself, and on her shoulder perched a creature that made Amy take a step back. The dragon was the size of a large dog, but Amy could feel the power radiating from it like heat from a star. Its scales were black as the void between galaxies, and its eyes glowed red like dying suns. The elf woman stopped a few paces away, and she studied Amy with an expression that was impossible to read. Amy had met elves before, but they had always looked at humans the way someone might look at a child playing with toys. This one looked at her differently, like she was seeing something the others had missed. The dragon on her shoulder made a sound that was part purr and part the rumble of distant thunder. The elf woman spoke then, and her voice was soft, but it carried a weight that made Amy stand straighter. She said her name was Lyraestra Moonshadow, and that she had lived for over 800 years. She said she had been in the council chamber during the meeting, and she had heard everything Amy and Kate had said. She said something that made Amy forget to breathe for a moment. She said that the humans were right. Kate made a sound of surprise, and Amy felt hope flare in her chest like a candle being lit in darkness. Lyraestra stepped closer, and the dragon called Nightwing watched them both with those terrible red eyes. Lyraestra told them that her people had forgotten something important, and that the elves had lived so long in peace that they no longer remembered what war truly meant. She said that when she was young, barely more than a child by elf standards, she had heard stories from her grandmother. Stories about darkness that came in cycles, and about civilizations that grew too comfortable and stopped watching the shadows. The other elves had dismissed these stories as myths, but Lyraestra had never forgotten them. She looked at Amy then and asked why humans could see what elder races could not. Amy thought about how to answer, and finally she said that maybe it was because humanity had never stopped fighting. Humans had wars among themselves and struggled against harsh worlds and faced dangers that would have destroyed softer species. They had never had 10,000 years of peace to make them forget that the universe was not a safe place. Lyraestra nodded slowly, and Nightwing made that thunder sound again. The elf woman said something then that would change everything. She said that she believed the humans and that she would help them even if it meant betraying her own people. Kate asked why an elf would do such a thing, and Lyraestra smiled, but it was a sad smile. She said that loyalty to truth was more important than loyalty to pride, and that she had not lived 800 years by ignoring her instincts. She said that Nightwing had been her companion for 6 centuries, and that dragons were older and wiser than any elf. She said that Nightwing could sense things that others could not, and that he had been restless for months. The dragon had felt something stirring in the dark places, and that was enough for... Lyraestra Amy looked at this strange elf woman with her ancient dragon, and she felt something she had not felt since entering the council chambers. She felt hope Lyraestra told them to return to their ship and wait, and that she would come to them when the time was right. She said she had access to ancient records that the council had locked away, and that she would find the truth even if it cost her everything. Then she turned and walked back into the shadows with Nightwing on her shoulder, and Amy and Kate were left standing alone in the garden. Kate spoke first, and she asked if they could trust an elf who would betray her own council. Amy watched the place where Lyraestra had disappeared, and she thought about the look in those violet eyes. She said that sometimes the people who broke the rules were the only ones worth trusting. They left Ethermore the next day, and as their ship pulled away from the crystalline world, Amy looked back one last time. She did not know if she would ever see Lyraestra again, but she knew that something had changed. For the first time since discovering the threat from the dark nebula, Amy felt like they might have a chance, somewhere in the ancient vaults beneath the council chambers, Lyra stood before a door that had not been opened in 1,000 years. Nightwing perched beside her, and his red eyes glowed brighter in the darkness. The elf woman placed her hand on the lock and spoke words in a language older than her civilization. The door opened with a sound like breaking ice, and inside was a book bound in material that seemed to absorb light. Lyra picked it up and felt the weight of prophecy in her hands. Nightwing spread his wings, and in the dragon speech that only she could understand, he said that the time of choice had come. Lyra nodded and tucked the book into her armor. She knew what she was about to do would make her an outcast among her people, but she had not lived 800 years by choosing the easy path. She left the vaults and walked toward her ship with Nightwing beside her. Above them, the stars shone cold and bright, and somewhere in the darkness between them, something ancient was waking up. The galaxy would soon learn that 10,000 years of peace was about to end, and it would learn that the youngest race might be the only one capable of surviving what came next. 3 weeks had passed since the meeting on Ethermoor, and the galaxy continued as it always had, with the elder races comfortable in their ancient power. Then everything changed. The attacks came without warning, and they came everywhere at once. 20 star systems went dark in the span of a single hour, and by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was already too late. The Void Collective had returned. On the bridge of the human vessel, defiant Captain Nicole Bryant watched her screens fill with contact warnings and felt her stomach turn to ice. She had been in combat before during the brief war with the Krathar mining corporations and during the colony defense actions on the Outer Rim, but this was different. The enemy ships that emerged from nowhere were like nothing in any database. They were black as the space between stars, and they seemed to bend light around them in ways that hurt to look at. Nicole gave orders with a calm voice that she did not feel, and her crew responded with the precision of people who trained for this moment, even though they never believed it would come. The Defiant was not a warship in the traditional sense, but rather an exploration vessel with defensive capabilities. Yet right now, it was the only human ship in this sector. Nicole watched as 3 Void dreadnoughts moved toward a Silverian battle station, and she knew what was about to happen before it did. The elves activated their legendary shields that had protected them for millennia, and they prepared to show these invaders why the Silverian Empire was feared across the galaxy. The Void ships fired weapons that looked like tears in reality itself, and the elf shields collapsed like paper in fire. The battle station broke apart in silence, and thousands of years of elf military tradition died with it. Nicole felt her hands grip the armrests of her command chair, and she made a decision that would either save her crew or doom them. She ordered the Defiant to attack her chief engineer. Beth Coleman looked at her with wide eyes and asked if she was certain. Because they were just one small ship against 3 massive dreadnoughts, Nicole said she was certain, and that if they did nothing, then everyone on that station died for nothing, and besides, the Void ships had not detected them yet. The Defiant moved in using the debris from the station as cover, and Nicole felt time slow down the way it always did in combat. She had learned long ago that fear was acceptable, but hesitation was death. The Defiant opened fire with kinetic railguns that launched solid metal slugs at a fraction of light speed. The weapons were considered primitive by Elder race standards because they had no energy, shields or exotic particles, but right now that did not matter. The slugs hit the nearest Void dreadnought and punched through its hull, and the enemy ship shuddered from the impact. Nicole felt shock run through her because that should not have worked. The Void ships had just destroyed elf shields that could stop anything, but somehow simple human kinetic weapons were getting through. Beth was already analyzing the sensor data, and she said something that made Nicole realize they had stumbled onto something crucial. She said the Void suppression fields were designed to counter energy weapons and exotic particles, but they did nothing against simple mass and velocity. The Void had studied the elder races for so long that they knew every trick and every technology, but humanity was too new. The enemy had no defense against weapons that were basically just throwing rocks very fast. Nicole ordered continuous fire, and the Defiant poured everything it had into the 3 Void ships. The second dreadnought took damage and began venting atmosphere, and the third one finally noticed the small human vessel. It turned toward them, and Nicole knew they had seconds before it fired. She ordered emergency acceleration, and the Defiant dove toward the nearest planet using gravity to slingshot them away. The Void weapon missed by mere kilometers, and where it passed, space itself seemed to crack. Nicole got her ship behind the planet, and then she did something crazy. She ordered a full spread of nuclear missiles. Beth stared at her and said that nuclear weapons had not been used in space combat for over a century because they were too slow and too easy to intercept. Nicole said that was exactly why they would work. The missiles launched and the Void ships tracked them with their sensors, but they did not fire interceptors because elder races had stopped using such primitive weapons generations ago. The Void computer systems were not programmed to respond to nuclear attack. 3 missiles detonated against the already damaged Void dreadnoughts, and the combined force of fusion fire and electromagnetic pulse tore through weakened hulls. 2 of the 3 enemy ships broke apart, and the third limped away trailing debris. Nicole sat back in her chair and tried to process what had just happened. A single human exploration ship had just destroyed 2 Void dreadnoughts and damaged a third. Across the galaxy, similar scenes were playing out as humanity discovered that their outdated weapons were somehow effective against an enemy that had adapted to defeat everything the elder races could throw at them. But the victory was small compared to the losses. The Silverian Empire lost half its star fleet in the first day. The Krathar Hive worlds went silent one by one. The Dolmar fortresses that had stood for 10,000 years crumbled under Void weapons. The Luminae discovered that their energy forms made them perfect targets for weapons designed to drain exotic particles. Only humanity seemed capable of fighting back, and even they were losing badly, far from the battle zones. Lyrestra Moonshadow stood in her private ship with Nightwing perched beside her, and she read the reports with growing horror. Her people were dying, and the council that had mocked the human warnings was now sending desperate pleas for help. She had been right, and being right felt like ashes in her mouth. Lyrestra had spent the past 3 weeks searching through forbidden archives, and what she had learned terrified her. The ancient book she had stolen contained a prophecy written in the old tongue, and it spoke of cycles that repeated across vast spans of time. Every 10,000 years, the Void returned to cull the galaxy of races that had grown stagnant. The book called it the Great Filter, and it said that only races capable of adaptation could survive. Elder races with their perfected technology and rigid traditions were exactly what the Void was designed to destroy. But there was another passage that gave Lyrestra hope. It spoke of the Iron Children who would come from a small blue world, and it said they would teach the Song of Stars anew. Nightwing made a low, rumbling sound and pressed his head against her shoulder. The dragon had been with her for 6 centuries, and in all that time she had learned to read his moods. Right now he was afraid, and dragons did not fear easily. Lyrestra made her decision. Then she set course for Earth, and as her ship jumped to faster-than-light travel, she sent a message to the Silverian High Council. She told them she was a traitor in their eyes because she had warned them, and they had not listened. She told them she was taking the forbidden texts to the humans because humanity was the galaxy's only hope. She told them that pride had destroyed the elder races, and that humility might save them. The council responded by stripping her of rank and title and declaring her an outcast. Lyrestra deleted the message without reading it all. She had expected nothing less. 3 days later, her ship emerged from faster-than-light travel near Earth, and immediately human defense platforms locked weapons onto her. Lyrestra sent her identification and requested permission to dock at the orbital station called Sanctuary. There was a long pause, and she imagined the confusion on Earth as they tried to decide if this was a trick. Finally, a voice came through her communication system, and it was a voice she recognized. Commander Amy Harrison asked what an elf outcast wanted with Earth. Lyraestra smiled despite everything, and she said she came to offer truth and alliance. She said that her people had been fools and that the humans had been right about everything. She said she had ancient knowledge that might help them survive, and she had a dragon who could sense things that technology could not. There was another pause, and then Amy told her she had permission to dock, but that she would be met by armed guards. Lyraestra said she expected nothing less, and that she would come unarmed except for Nightwing. Amy asked if the dragon was a weapon. Lyraestra looked at Nightwing, and the ancient creature looked back with eyes that had seen centuries pass. She said that Nightwing was not a weapon, but a friend, and that humans would understand the difference. Her ship docked at Sanctuary, and when the airlock opened, there were indeed armed guards waiting. But there was also Amy Harrison, and behind her stood Kate Mitchell, and both of them looked like they had not slept in days. Lyraestra stepped into the station with Nightwing on her shoulder, and for a moment, everyone just stared. The dragon was small compared to the legends, but there was something about him that made hardened soldiers take a step back. His scales absorbed light, and his red eyes seemed to look into souls. Amy stepped forward, and she studied Lyraestra with an expression that was hard to read. She asked why an elf would betray her own people. Lyraestra met her gaze and said she had not betrayed her people, but rather she had chosen truth over pride. She said that the Silverian Empire would call her traitor, but that she would rather be an honest traitor than a loyal fool. Kate asked what the elf had brought, and Lyraestra pulled out the ancient book. She explained what it contained and how it spoke of cycles and adaptation and the Iron Children from the Blue World. Amy listened to it all, and when Lyraestra finished, there was silence. Then Amy did something unexpected. She offered her hand in the human gesture of greeting and alliance. She said that Earth needed all the help it could get, and that anyone willing to stand against the void was welcome. Regardless of what their own people thought, Lyraestra took the offered hand and felt warmth in the human grip. Nightwing made a sound that might have been approval. This was how the alliance began, with an outcast elf and her ancient dragon standing on a human station while the galaxy burned around them. Admiral Lisa Grant arrived an hour later, and she was a tall woman with gray hair and eyes that had seen too many battles. She listened to everything Lyraestra had to say, and she read the translated passages from the ancient book. Finally, she asked the question that everyone was thinking. She asked if the elf truly believed that humanity could win this war. Lyraestra looked at the admiral, and she spoke with absolute certainty. She said that humanity could not win alone, but that together with the knowledge of elder races and the adaptability of humans, they might break the cycle. She said that the Void had never encountered a race that combined ancient wisdom with youthful chaos. She said that dragons could travel between dimensions and that Nightwing could go places the Void could not detect. She said that elf magic combined with human technology might create something entirely new. Lisa listened, and then she made a decision that would change everything. She authorized full cooperation with Lyraestra, and she ordered the best scientists and engineers to work with the elf on combining their knowledge. She also did something that shocked everyone. She asked if Nightwing would be willing to work with human pilots. The dragon spread his wings and made a sound like distant thunder. Lyraestra smiled and said that Nightwing had been waiting for someone to ask. The war room on Sanctuary Station hummed with activity as humans, and the lone elf worked side by side for the first time in history. Lyraestra stood before a holographic display showing the current state of the galaxy, and the view was grim. Red markers showed void-controlled systems, and they were spreading like a plague. Dr. Laura Price sat at a nearby console with the ancient book open beside her and translation software running continuously. Laura was a xenoarchaeologist who had spent her career studying dead civilizations, and now she was learning that some of those civilizations had faced the same enemy that threatened them today. She called Lyra Estra over and pointed at a passage she had just finished translating. The text spoke of previous cycles and how each time a different race had risen to challenge the void. Each time the challengers had failed because they relied on what had made them strong in the first place. The magic users tried to win with magic, and the technology builders tried to win with technology, but the void adapted to everything. Eventually, Laura asked what made this cycle different. Lyra Estra looked at the human woman and said that this time there were two types of strength working together. She said that elf magic had grown rigid over millennia because they had perfected it to the point where innovation seemed unnecessary. She said that human technology was chaotic and constantly changing because humans never stopped trying to improve. Together they might create something the void could not predict. Across the station in a training bay, something remarkable was happening. Nightwing had agreed to let human pilots bond with him, and a young pilot named Sophie Turner was the first to volunteer. Sophie was 26 years old and she had flown combat missions against pirates and corporate raiders, but nothing had prepared her for this. Nightwing stood before her with his scales gleaming like oil on water, and his red eyes fixed on hers. The dragon was the size of a large horse, now having grown since arriving on the station, and Sophie felt very small. Lyra Estra explained that bonding with a dragon required trust on both sides, and that Nightwing would share his senses with Sophie if she opened her mind to him. Sophie asked how to do that, and Lyra Estra smiled. She said to simply, "Stop trying to control everything and let the dragon in." Sophie closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and then she felt something brush against her thoughts. It was like standing at the edge of an ocean and feeling the first wave touch your feet. Then the wave crashed over her, and suddenly she was seeing through two sets of eyes. She saw herself standing there looking small and fragile, and she saw the room from above because Nightwing had lifted into the air. She felt the dragon wings beating and the air currents flowing, and she understood flight in a way no human ever had. Sophie gasped and opened her eyes, and Nightwing landed beside her with a rumble that sounded pleased. Lyra Estra said that was a good start, and that with practice Sophie would be able to fly with Nightwing as naturally as she flew her own ship. Over the next week, 6 more pilots bonded with the dragon, and each time the connection grew stronger, Nightwing could be in multiple places by sharing his consciousness, and he could see in dimensions that humans could not perceive. The pilots began to understand things that should have been impossible. They could sense void ships before sensors detected them, and they could navigate through spatial distortions that would confuse computer systems. Meanwhile, in the research labs, something equally incredible was taking shape. Beth Coleman worked alongside Lyra Estra to combine human engineering with elf magic, and the results were unlike anything either civilization had created alone. Beth had designed a new type of weapon that used human railgun technology, but the projectiles were wrapped in what Lyra Estra called star weaving. The magic did not make the projectiles more powerful, but it made them exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously. When fired, these weapons could hit void ships even when they tried to phase out of normal space. The first test was conducted in a secure area outside the station, and everyone held their breath as Beth activated the prototype. The weapon fired, and the projectile seemed to shimmer as it flew. It hit the target drone, and the drone ceased to exist in a way that was hard to describe. It did not explode or break apart, but simply stopped being there. Laura checked her sensors and said the drone had been removed from this dimension entirely. Beth and Lyra Estra looked at each other and smiled because they had just created something the void had never seen before. Admiral Lisa Grant watched all of this with a mixture of hope and disbelief. She had commanded fleets for 30 years, and she thought she understood warfare. But this was something new. She called a meeting with her senior staff and Lyra Estra to discuss strategy. Amy Harrison attended along with Kate Mitchell and Nicole Bryant, who had been recalled from the front lines. Lisa laid out the situation. Plainly, humanity was holding its own in small engagements because the Void had not adapted to human weapons yet, but it was only a matter of time. The elder races were falling apart with their rigid command structures, unable to cope with an enemy that broke all their rules. The galaxy needed a unified response, but the council was in chaos. Lisa asked Lyrestra if the other elder races would accept human leadership. The elf woman was quiet for a moment, and then she said something that surprised them all. She said the elder races would never accept humans as leaders because their pride would not allow it. But they might accept a coalition where humans and elves worked as equals with other races joining as partners. She said the key was not to ask for permission, but to prove it could work. Lisa understood, and she made a bold proposal. She said they would launch a joint operation using human ships with elf advisors and dragon-enhanced pilots. They would target a void staging area, and they would broadcast the entire battle to every system in the galaxy. They would show everyone that cooperation worked better than pride. The operation was planned for 3 days later, and those 3 days were filled with frantic preparation. Sophie and the other dragon-bonded pilots trained constantly with Nightwing, teaching them new ways to perceive space and time. Beth worked around the clock to produce enough of the new dimensional weapons to arm a strike force. Lyrestra taught crash courses in elf magic to humans who showed aptitude, and she was amazed at how quickly some of them learned. Amy Harrison surprised everyone by being especially talented at what Lyra Estra called reality weaving. The human commander could not match an elf who had trained for centuries, but she had something elves often lacked. She had instinct and creativity. Where elves followed precise patterns, Amy improvised, and sometimes her wild attempts created effects that were more powerful than traditional methods. Lyrestra told her that this was exactly what the galaxy needed, and that rigid tradition was the enemy of survival. The day of the operation arrived, and 15 human ships prepared to launch with Lyrestra and Nightwing aboard the lead vessel. Lisa had chosen Nicole to command the mission because she had proven herself in the first encounters with the Void. The target was a Void mothership that was gathering forces to attack the Krathar homeworld. If they could destroy it, they might buy the Krathar time to evacuate their civilians. The fleet jumped to faster-than-light travel and emerged in the target system exactly where intelligence said the Void would be. They were right. The mothership hung in space like a wound in reality, and around it swarmed hundreds of smaller Void vessels. Nicole felt her mouth go dry because they were outnumbered at least 20-1. Then Nightwing spoke in her mind through the bond, and his voice was like ancient stones grinding together. He said that numbers meant nothing when the enemy could not see you coming. The dragon-bonded pilots activated their enhanced perception, and suddenly they could sense the Void ships in dimensions the enemy did not know humans could perceive. They found weak points in the enemy formation and paths. Through the swarm that sensors would never detect, Nicole gave the order to attack. The human ships dove into the Void formation like knives through silk, and they fired the new dimensional weapons as they went. Void ships simply ceased to exist as the projectiles found them, and the enemy fleet fell into confusion. They had never encountered weapons that could erase matter from multiple dimensions. Nightwing grew to his full size, which was massive beyond anything the humans had imagined, and he flew alongside the ships, breathing fire that burned in colors that had no name. The dragon fire did not just destroy, but it purified, and wherever it touched, Void corruption simply vanished. Lyrestra stood on the bridge of Nicole's ship, and she wove magic that she had not used in centuries. She called on the old words and the power of stars, and she created shields around the human vessels that shimmered with impossible beauty. Void weapons hit those shields and bounced away harmlessly. Amy stood beside her, and together they created something new. Amy took the elf patterns and twisted them in ways that should not work but did, and the resulting magic was wild and unpredictable. It wrapped around void ships and unmade them, or it created pockets of altered space that trapped enemy vessels. The battle raged for 3 hours, and every second of it was broadcast across the galaxy. The elder races watched in shock as humans and one outcast elf did what entire fleets had failed to do. They watched as rigid military doctrine was replaced by improvisation and creativity. They watched as the youngest race in the galaxy showed them what adaptation really meant. Finally, the Void mothership tried to retreat, and Nicole ordered all ships to focus fire. The dimensional weapons hit simultaneously along with dragon fire and elf magic and human ingenuity. The mothership broke apart, and with it died the Void presence in that entire sector. Nicole sat back in her command chair and tried to process what had just happened. They had won. Not just survived, but won decisively against overwhelming odds. Across the galaxy, the broadcast was having an impact. The Silverian High Council called an emergency session, and for the first time in their history, they voted to request aid from a younger race. The Krathar sent thanks and offered to share their hive mind computing power to help coordinate future battles. The Dolmar broke their 1,000-year silence to say that humans had earned their respect. Even the Lumini, who had dismissed humanity as primitive, now asked to learn from them. Admiral Lisa Grant received all these messages, and she knew that everything had changed. The elder races were finally listening, but she also knew that this was just one battle, and the war was far from over. The Void was adapting already, and next time they would be ready for dimensional weapons and dragon fire. The real test was yet to come. On the bridge of her ship, Lyra Estra stood with Amy and Nicole, and they looked at the stars. The elf woman said that they had shown the galaxy what was possible, but now they had to build on that success. She said that more elves would come, and more elder races would join the fight. She said that the coalition they had dreamed of was becoming real. Amy asked if she thought they could win. Lyrestra looked at Nightwing, who perched nearby with his red eyes, glowing. The dragon made a sound that was part purr and part thunder. Lyra Estra smiled and said that for the first time in 800 years, she believed victory was possible. Not because they were stronger than the Void, but because they were willing to change. And change was the one thing the ancient enemy could not understand. The coalition grew stronger with each passing week as more elder races joined the fight against the Void. Elf mages began teaching humans their arts, and humans taught the elves about improvisation and breaking rules. The Krathar shared their computing networks, and the Dolmar offered their fortress worlds as staging grounds. But victory remained elusive. The Void was adapting faster than anyone anticipated, and the dimensional weapons that had been so effective were becoming less reliable. Ships equipped with dragon fire support still had an advantage, but Nightwing could not be everywhere at once. Kate Mitchell spent her days analyzing battle data and her nights studying the ancient texts with Laura Price. There had to be something they were missing, and Kate was determined to find it. One evening, she called Laura over to her console with excitement in her voice. She had found references in archaeological databases to ruins predating the Silverian Empire by thousands of years. The ruins were on abandoned worlds in sectors now controlled by the Void, but the descriptions matched symbols from Lyra Estra ancient book. Laura studied the data, and her eyes widened. She said these were not just old ruins, but evidence of previous civilizations that had faced the Void, and lost Kate asked if there might be records left behind, and Laura said there was only one way to find out. They brought their findings to Admiral Lisa Grant, and she immediately saw the implications. If they could learn how previous civilizations had fought the Void, they might understand its weaknesses better. But reaching those ruins meant penetrating deep into Void territory, and that was a suicide mission. Unless they had advantages, the Void could not counter. Nicole volunteered to lead the expedition, and Sophie Turner insisted on coming with her dragon bond to Nightwing. Lyraestra said she would go as well because the ancient texts mentioned her people might have been part of a previous cycle. Lisa approved the mission, but insisted they take a small, fast ship that could avoid detection rather than a combat fleet. The ship they chose was called the Seeker, and it was designed for exploration rather than battle. The crew consisted of Nicole as captain and Sophie as pilot, along with Kate for analysis and Lyraestra as their guide to ancient knowledge, Nightwing. Of course went with them, and his presence made the small ship feel crowded but safer. They jumped to the target system 3 days later and emerged near a dead world that sensors said had once been inhabited. The planet's surface was gray and lifeless, but structures still stood like bones of a long-dead giant. Sophie used her dragon bond to scan for void presence, and she reported that the area seemed clear. They landed near the largest structure and suited up for surface exploration. The atmosphere was thin but breathable, and the gravity was slightly higher than Earth normal. Nicole led the team into the ruins with weapons ready, even though they hoped to avoid combat. Inside, the structures were covered in symbols that made Laura gasp with recognition. She said these were not elf runes, but something older, and that the style matched references from before the current galactic civilizations. Kate began recording everything while Lyraestra studied the walls with an expression that was hard to read. The elf woman touched one symbol and spoke a word in a language so old it hurt to hear. The walls began to glow with soft light, and suddenly they could see images forming in the air. It was a recording left by whoever built this place, and it showed a civilization at its height. The beings in the images were tall and graceful, with features that reminded Nicole of elves, but not quite. They had advanced technology and powerful magic, and they ruled a vast empire. Then the images showed darkness coming, and ships that looked exactly like modern void vessels. The civilization fought back with everything they had, and for a time they held the line, but eventually they fell because they could not adapt fast enough. The recording showed the last survivors leaving a message for whoever came after Laura, translated haltingly, and said they warned that the void returned in cycles to destroy any civilization that grew too comfortable. They said the only way to survive was to never stop evolving and to never believe you had reached perfection. The images faded, and the team stood in silence, processing what they had seen. Lyraestra spoke then, and her voice was strange. She said she recognized the beings in the recording and that they were called the predecessors. She said elf legends spoke of them as the race that came before, but that most elves dismissed the stories as myth. Kate asked how old these ruins were, and Laura checked her instruments. She said they were at least 12,000 years old, which meant they predated the current cycle by 2,000 years. That was when Nightwing made a sound that no one had heard before. It was not a roar or a purr, but something that resonated in bones and made reality feel thin. Sophie gasped and grabbed her head, and Nicole moved to help her. The pilot said that Nightwing was sharing something and that it was too big to fit in human understanding. Lyraestra moved quickly and placed her hands on Sophie's temples and spoke words of power. She helped the pilot process what the dragon was trying to show, and slowly Sophie began to speak. She said that Nightwing remembered and that dragons were far older than anyone knew. She said that dragons had existed across multiple cycles and that they had witnessed civilizations rise and fall again and again. She said that dragons were created by a race even older than the predecessors to serve as memory keepers for the galaxy. Their purpose was to remember what others forgot and to guide new races when the cycles turned. Sophie's voice changed, then taking on a quality that was not quite human. It was Nightwing speaking through their bond, and he said he was tired of watching civilizations die. He said that every cycle a race rose to challenge the void, and every cycle they failed because they relied on a single strength. He said that humanity was different because they had no single strength, but rather adapted to use whatever worked. He said that was why he had chosen to bond with humans and why he had brought Lyrestra to them. The dragon memory showed them things from previous cycles, and it was overwhelming. They saw dozens of civilizations, and each one had been more advanced than modern galactic society. Each one had been destroyed by the void. But there was something else in the memory, and Kate caught it first. She asked Nightwing to show them the void origins again. The dragon complied, and they saw something shocking. The void had not always been an enemy, but had started as a created thing. An ancient race older than dragons had built it as a kind of immune system for the galaxy. Its purpose was to force civilizations to evolve by challenging them periodically. But something had gone wrong and the void had become too effective. Instead of challenging civilizations to grow, it had started destroying them completely. The void itself was trapped in a cycle and could not stop. Even though its original creators were long gone, Nicole tried to understand the implications, and she asked if the void wanted to be stopped. Nightwing rumbled affirmatively. Laura asked how they could possibly stop something designed to destroy civilizations. Lyrestra spoke then, and she said she needed to tell them something she had hidden. She said she was not 800 years old, as she had claimed, but rather much older. She said she had lived through the last cycle as a child and had been one of the few survivors. The elves of today were descended from the refugees who escaped and rebuilt, but they had forgotten their past. She had kept her true age secret, because remembering was painful, and because her people were not ready to hear the truth. She said that Nightwing had been with her since before the last cycle, and that together they had waited for a race that could break the pattern Amy had taught her, that humanity had the chaos and creativity needed. Sophie asked what they needed to do, and Lyrestra said they needed to reach the void's central consciousness. She said it existed in a dimension between normal space and that only dragons could navigate there. She said they needed to combine human innovation with elf magic and dragon wisdom to create a weapon unlike anything that had existed before. Not a weapon to destroy, but a weapon to reprogram. Nicole understood then, and she said they needed to change the void purpose back to what it originally was. They needed to make it challenge rather than destroy. Kate said that would require accessing the void core programming, and that meant penetrating to the heart of enemy territory. Lyrestra nodded and said this was always where the path led. She said that was why she had come to the humans and why Nightwing had chosen to bond with their pilots. She said that destiny was not predetermined, but this moment had been building across cycles. They returned to the Seeker and transmitted everything they had learned to Admiral Lisa Grant. The response came quickly, and Lisa said she was assembling the Coalition fleet for a final offensive. She said they would create a distraction large enough to let a small team reach the Void Nexus. She said that team would consist of those who understood what needed to be done. Back on Sanctuary Station, preparations began for what everyone knew would be the final battle. Beth Coleman worked with Lyrestra to create a device that could interface with the void consciousness. It combined human quantum computing with elf reality weaving and dragon dimensional navigation. Amy Harrison trained intensively with Lyrestra to prepare for magical combat in a place where normal rules did not apply. Sophie and the other dragon-bonded pilots practiced formations with Nightwing, who would lead them into the Nexus. Nicole coordinated with fleet commanders from a dozen races, each bringing their unique capabilities to the fight. The plan was audacious and probably impossible, but that had never stopped humans before. They would attack the void on every front simultaneously, forcing it to spread its forces thin. Then a strike team would use Nightwing ability to travel between dimensions to reach the Nexus. Once there, they would deploy Beth device and reprogram the Void Core. If it worked, the galaxy would be saved. If it failed, everyone would die, but at least they would die trying. The night before the operation, Lyra Estra stood on the observation deck looking at Earth below. Amy joined her, and for a long time neither spoke. Finally, Lyra Estra said she had lived thousands of years and seen many wonders, but humanity impressed her more than anything. Amy asked why, and Lyra Estra smiled. She said because humans refused to accept impossible as an answer. She said that was why they would win tomorrow. Amy said she hoped the elf was right, because she was terrified. Lyra Estra put a hand on her shoulder and said fear was wisdom and that only fools felt no fear. She said they would face the impossible together, and together they might achieve it. Nightwing appeared then, having grown to his full cosmic size. He said in the old tongue that the time of choosing was over. Tomorrow they would either break the cycle or become another forgotten civilization. But either way they would face it with courage, and that was all anyone could ask. The stars shone cold above them, and somewhere in the darkness, the void waited. The final battle was coming, and the galaxy held its breath. The Coalition fleet assembled at the edge of void space, and it was the largest gathering of ships in galactic history. 300 vessels from 12 different races hung in formation, and each carried the hopes of trillions. Admiral Lisa Grant stood on the bridge of her flagship and looked at the force she commanded. Elf cruisers, with their elegant curves and magical shields, flew alongside human dreadnoughts with their blunt practicality. Krathar hive ships pulsed with shared consciousness, and Dalmar fortress craft sat like mobile mountains. The Lumini had sent energy beings who could possess and control automated weapons, and dozens of other races contributed what they could. But the real key to the plan was the small team preparing to enter Nightwing Dimensional Gateway. Nicole checked her gear one last time and tried not to think about how insane this mission was. They were going to fly into a place that existed outside normal physics and reprogram an ancient weapon while reality itself tried to kill them. Amy stood beside her, and her hands glowed faintly with the magic Lyra Estra had taught her. The human commander had learned in weeks what took elves decades, but her power was raw and unpredictable. Lyra Estra wore armor that seemed woven from starlight itself, and her violet eyes blazed with determination. She had lived through the fall of her first civilization, and she would not let it happen again. Beth Coleman carried the device that would either save them all or fail spectacularly, and she tried not to think about the weight of responsibility. Sophie Turner and 5 other dragon-bonded pilots stood ready, and they could feel Nightwing presence in their minds. The dragon had grown to a size that defied comprehension, and his scales reflected galaxies. Lisa gave the order to begin, and the fleet moved forward into void territory. Almost immediately, the enemy responded, and thousands of void ships emerged from twisted space. The battle began with a fury that shook solar systems. Human railguns fired solid metal slugs that punched through void hulls, and elf mages wove shields that turned away dark weapons. Krathar computing power coordinated attacks with inhuman precision, and Dolmar fortress ships absorbed damage that would destroy lesser vessels. The void fought back with weapons that unmade reality, and ships vanished into dimensional tiers. But the Coalition had learned from previous battles, and they adapted constantly. When the Void used one tactic, the Coalition countered with something new. It was chaos, but it was organized chaos, and that made all the difference. While the battle raged, Nightwing opened a gateway that looked like a wound in space. Nicole felt her stomach turn as she looked at it, because every instinct screamed that going through was death. But she had been a soldier too long to let instinct stop duty. The strike team entered the gateway, and reality bent around them. They found themselves in a place that could not be described in normal terms. Up and down had no meaning, and time flowed in multiple directions simultaneously. Colors existed that human eyes were not designed to see, and sounds made, thoughts visible. Sophie and the other pilots used their dragon bond to navigate, and Nightwing guided them through impossible geometries. Amy felt her magic surge and twist as the rules of physics became suggestions rather than laws. Lyra wove patterns that stabilized the team and kept them anchored to something resembling sanity. They traveled for what felt like hours or seconds, and finally they emerged into the void nexus. The nexus was a vast space filled with darkness that seemed alive, and at its center pulsed something that hurt to perceive. It was the void consciousness, and it was aware of them. A voice spoke that was not sound, but rather meaning impressed directly onto their minds. It said they should not be here, and that they would be unmade like all the others. Nicole stepped forward, and she spoke with a voice that did not waver. She said they came not to destroy, but to offer freedom. The void consciousness paused, and curiosity rippled through the darkness. It asked what freedom could be offered to something bound by its purpose. Amy spoke then, and her words were wrapped in the magic Lyra had taught her. She said that the void had been created to challenge civilizations, but had become corrupted into destroying them. She said that its original creators were gone, but that did not mean it had to remain broken. She said they could fix it and restore its true purpose. The darkness swirled, and Nicole felt pressure build as the void considered. Finally it spoke, and said that it had wanted to stop for millennia, but could not break its own programming. It said that it remembered what it was supposed to be, and mourned what it had become. It said that if they could truly offer freedom, then it would not resist. Beth moved forward with her device, and Lyra helped her position it at the Nexus core. The device hummed with power that combined human quantum computing with elf magic and dragon dimensional essence. Beth activated it, and reality screamed. The void, consciousness convulsed as new code rewrote ancient programming. The team felt reality buckle, and Nightwing roared in the old tongue to hold on. Back in normal space, the Void Fleet suddenly stopped fighting, and ships hung motionless in confusion. Lisa watched her sensors and hoped beyond hope that the mission had succeeded. Inside the Nexus, the device completed its work, and the Void consciousness changed. It fragmented into millions of smaller pieces, but these pieces were not hostile. They were curious and creative and ready to fulfill their original purpose. The voice spoke one final time, and it thanked them for giving it back itself. It said that from this day forward it would challenge rather than destroy. It said that civilizations would still face trials, but those trials would be tests to overcome rather than extinction events. The Nexus began to collapse as the central consciousness distributed itself, and Nightwing grabbed the team with dimensional claws. They flew back through impossible space and emerged in normal reality just as the gateway sealed behind them. The Coalition fleet erupted in cheers as sensors showed the Void ships withdrawing, not retreating in defeat, but rather dispersing to begin their new purpose. The war was over. Nicole sat in her ship and tried to process what had just happened. They had done the impossible and rewritten the fate of the galaxy. Amy collapsed into a seat, and her magic flickered out. As exhaustion hit Lyra, smiled with tears streaming down her face, because after thousands of years the cycle was finally broken. Beth checked her device, and it was completely burned out from the power it had channeled. Sophie and the other pilots felt Nightwing presence withdraw slightly now that the crisis was past. The dragon had earned his rest. Admiral Lisa Grant sent a message to all Coalition ships, and she declared victory. She said that this day would be remembered as the day the galaxy learned to work together. She said that humanity had led them not through superior force, but through adaptability and creativity. She said that the elder races had contributed wisdom and power, and that together they were stronger than any could be alone. The fleet returned to Sanctuary Station, and celebrations began across known space. The Silverian High Council formally apologized to Lyra and offered to restore her titles. She refused politely and said she preferred to remain an outcast if that meant staying true to herself. The Krathar offered to make Amy an honorary hive mother for her role in the victory. She accepted, but admitted she had no idea what the title meant. The Dolmar broke another 1,000-year silence to name Nicole a stone friend, which was apparently a great honor. She accepted gracefully and made a note to research what that actually meant. Nightwing returned to a smaller size, though he could now expand to cosmic proportions whenever needed. He spent his time teaching new generations of dragon-bonded pilots and seemed content. Beth was offered a dozen research positions, but chose to stay on Earth and continue combining human and elf technology. The discoveries she made would revolutionize both civilizations. Laura continued her archaeological work, but now she studied living cultures, learning from elder races while teaching them human perspectives. Kate took a position coordinating coalition intelligence because the galaxy still had problems, even if the Void was no longer one of them. Lisa retired from active duty after 50 years of service, but remained as an advisor to the new coalition government. Earth became the capital of the coalition, not because humans demanded it, but because everyone agreed it was fitting. The world that had been mocked for its youth now served as a hub where all races came to learn and teach. 50 years after the battle, Amy Harrison stood on the observation deck of Sanctuary Station with gray in her hair and lines on her face. Lyra Astra stood beside her, looking exactly as she had 5 decades earlier because elves aged slowly. They watched ships come and go, representing dozens of races working together. Young humans trained with elf mages and elf children learned human innovation. Krathar shared their hive networks, and Dolmar taught patience, and the Lumini showed the beauty of energy forms. The galaxy had changed fundamentally, and it had changed because one species refused to accept that things had to stay the same. Amy asked if Lyra Astra had ever imagined this future, and the elf smiled. She said she had lived through the fall of one civilization and the stagnation of another. She said she had waited thousands of years for a race that could break the cycle. She said humanity had exceeded her wildest hopes. Amy said they could not have done it without the elves and the dragons and all the other races. Lyra Astra agreed and said that was exactly the point. No single race could have won alone, but together they had achieved the impossible. Nightwing appeared then, flying through space without a ship because dragons needed no such things. He landed on the observation deck, and his red eyes glowed with ancient wisdom. He spoke in the old tongue, and both Amy and Lyra Astra understood because language barriers had fallen long ago. He said that the galaxy was finally learning the lesson that should have been learned cycles ago. He said that diversity was strength, and that rigid perfection was death. He said that as long as civilizations remembered to adapt and work together, they would thrive. Amy reached out and touched the dragon scales that were cool and warm at the same time. She said that humanity had been mocked for being young and inexperienced. She said they had been dismissed as primitives who did not understand the galaxy. She said she was glad they had been underestimated because it meant no one stopped them from trying the impossible. Lyra Astra laughed, and it was a sound of pure joy. She said that underestimating humanity was a mistake the elder races would never make again. She said that the Iron Children from the Blue World had taught the galaxy to dream again. Nightwing spread his wings and roared, and the sound echoed across the stars. It was a roar of triumph and hope, and the promise of a future where all races stood together. The cycle was broken, and the eternal war was over. Humanity had saved the galaxy, not through weapons or magic, but through the simple refusal to accept that change was impossible. And in doing so, they had taught everyone the most important lesson, that the youngest flame truly does burn the hottest, and that chaos guided by purpose is the greatest force in the universe. The stars shone bright over Earth and across the galaxy. Billions looked up with hope. The age of stagnation had ended, and the age of endless possibility had begun. All because one species dared to believe that things could be different. All because humanity refused to let fear stop them from reaching for the impossible. And all because an ancient elf and her dragon had seen in humanity what others had missed, the courage to change everything.